February 8, 1942. Rassenburg, East Prussia. A Heinkel 111 bomber taxis down a frozen runway at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's secret headquarters deep in the forests of the Eastern Front. Inside sits Dr. Fritz Todt, the Reich Minister for Armaments and Munitions. He is the man responsible for the Autobahns and the West Wall, a technocrat who has just spent hours arguing with the Fuhrer, trying to explain a terrifying mathematical reality. The war against the Soviet Union is lost. Todt believes the industrial capacity of the Reich cannot sustain a war of attrition against the combined might of the British Empire, the United States, and the USSR. The plane lifts off, banking into the gray winter sky. Moments later, a catastrophic explosion tears the aircraft apart. It crashes in a ball of fire, killing everyone on board. In the wreckage of that plane lay the shattered remnants of Germany's old war economy. But from the ashes of that crash, a new, far more dangerous era was about to rise. The death of Fritz Todt forced Adolf Hitler to make an immediate appointment, a decision that would confound his generals and arguably prolong the Second World War by 2, perhaps 3 years. He did not choose a general. He did not choose a seasoned industrial tycoon. He chose his favorite architect, a man who had spent the last decade designing domes and stadiums, not tanks and machine guns. His name was Albert Speer, and his appointment marked the moment Germany finally stopped fighting a political war and began fighting a total war. If you're the kind of viewer who looks at history and asks not just what happened, but how is it physically possible to sustain, then you are in the right place. We are dedicated to analyzing the leadership decisions and logistical realities that define the 20th century. Please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our deep dives into mechanics of history. To understand why Albert Speer's appointment in 1942 was such a seismic shift, we must first dismantle one of the most persistent myths of the Second World War, the myth of the Nazi industrial juggernaut. Popular culture often portrays the Third Reich in 1939 and 1940 as a hyper-efficient, fully mobilized machine, a monolithic state where every factory and every worker was dedicated to production of war material with ruthless precision. The reality, as historians like Adam Tooze have painstakingly documented, was startlingly different. For the first 2.5 years of the war, the German economy was a chaotic, bureaucratic mess, plagued by inefficiency, infighting, and a shocking lack of standardization. When German tanks rolled into Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, they were not backed by a total war economy. They were backed by what we might call a blitzkrieg economy. The Nazi leadership, haunted by the memory of 1918, was terrified of imposing strict rationing or harsh working conditions on the German populace. They feared that if the home front suffered too much, they would face a revolution from within, just as the Kaiser had. As a result, in 1940, the year Germany conquered Europe, consumer goods production remained high. The factories were still producing furniture, porcelain, and civilian suits while the army was fighting in France. Most factories ran only a single shift. At night, the machines sat silent. Women were not conscripted into the workforce. The regime was effectively trying to win a world war without inconveniencing its own population. Furthermore, the administration of armaments was paralyzed by a system known as bureaucracy. There was no single hand on the tiller. The Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, competed viciously against one another for raw materials. If the Army wanted steel for tanks and Hermann Göring wanted aluminum for planes, they didn't coordinate. They bid against each other. There was no centralization. A factory making parts of the Junkers 88 bomber might sit idle waiting for a specific gauge of wire, while a factory down the road had tons of it, hoarding it for a tank contract. It was a feudal system of overlapping empires. The result was a logistical nightmare of non-standardization. By 1941, the German army was utilizing a bewildering array of vehicles. They used captured French trucks, Czech tanks, British lorries abandoned at Dunkirk, and dozens of different German prototypes. One infantry division might require spare parts for 80 different types of engines. It was an inefficient, artisan approach to industrial warfare. They prioritized high-quality craftsmanship and constant technical innovation over mass production. While the Soviets were building thousands of rough but functional T-34s, German engineers were halting production lines to make minor adjustments to a headlight design or a seat bracket. They were obsessed with perfection in a war that demanded volume. This blitzkrieg economy worked only as long as the wars were short. In Poland, Norway, and France, the stockpiles of ammunition and fuel were sufficient for campaigns lasting a few weeks. The victories were so rapid that the inefficiency of the supply chain was masked by the glory of the newsreels. The leadership in Berlin became complacent. They believed they had cracked the code of modern warfare. Strike hard, win fast, and loot the conquered nation to pay for the next campaign. They believed they didn't need to mobilize fully. They believed they could have guns and butter. Then came June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. For the first few months, the illusion held. The Wehrmacht smashed through the Red Army, encircling millions of men. But as the distances grew and the autumn rains turned the Russian roads into swamps, the wheels began to come off the German war machine, literally and metaphorically. The consumption of ammunition exceeded production by a terrifying margin. Tanks broke down and could not be repaired because the spare parts didn't exist or were stuck on a train in Poland. The winter of 1941 arrived, and the German soldier froze in his summer uniform because the economy had not pivoted to produce winter gear in time. By December 1941, the blitzkrieg had failed at the gates of Moscow. The United States had entered the war. The conflict had transformed from a series of European sprints into a global marathon of attrition. Germany was now at war with the three greatest industrial powers on Earth: the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. And Germany was still operating on a peacetime industrial footing. Fritz Todt saw this coming. He was a realist. He knew the numbers didn't add up. He knew that without a radical restructuring, a dictatorship of production, Germany would be crushed by the sheer weight of Allied material. He tried to warn Hitler. He tried to explain that the disorganized, competing fiefdoms of the German military-industrial complex were a suicide pact. But Todt was tired, and his influence was waning. When his plane exploded on that freezing February morning in 1942, it left a vacuum at the very top of the Reich's economic hierarchy. The generals expected one of their own to take over. The industrial barons, the heads of Krupp and Rheinmetall, expected a businessman. Hermann Göring, ever greedy for power, expected to absorb the ministry into his own 4-year plan. When Albert Speer took control of the Ministry of Armaments in February 1942, he was 36 years old. He was the youngest minister in the Reich. To the grizzled Prussian generals of the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office, he was nothing more than an artistic dilettante, a man who knew how to drape flags and light cathedrals but knew nothing about ballistics or assembly lines. They expected him to fail. They expected him to be swallowed whole by the labyrinthine bureaucracy that had stifled German industry for years. But Speer possessed a weapon that the generals did not. He had the absolute, unwavering confidence of the dictator, and he used it to stage a coup against the military establishment. Speer's first realization was simple but revolutionary in the context of the Nazi state. The military was incompetent at business. For years, the Army Ordnance Office had dictated every minute detail of production. A general would tell a factory owner not just what to build, but how to build it down to the placement of the last rivet. They constantly interrupted production lines to demand trivial design changes, a slightly more comfortable seat, a different kind of optical sight. These interruptions were fatal to mass production. It meant machines stopped, workers waited, and tooling had to be changed. It was an approach suited for a craft workshop, not a total war. Speer's solution was a concept called industrial self-responsibility. It sounds like a dry corporate policy, but it was a sledgehammer that broke the bottleneck. He summoned the leaders of German industry, the heads of Mercedes-Benz, Rheinmetall, Siemens, and Krupp, and he offered them a deal. He told them, effectively, the military will tell you what they need, a tank that shoots this far and has as much armor. But how you build it is now your problem. I don't care about the process. I only care about the finished product. He kicked the military overseers out of factories. He replaced the bureaucratic oversight with main committees run by the engineers and industrialists themselves. It was the introduction of rational, technocratic management to a chaotic feudal system. If you are fascinated by how logistical systems and management decisions can alter the course of history just as much as battlefield tactics, please subscribe to the channel. We explore the machinery behind the war to give you the full picture. The results of this reorganization were immediate and staggering. It became known as the armaments miracle. Within 6 months of Speer taking office, German armament production began to climb vertically. In 1941, the average monthly production of tanks was hover around 350. By the end of 1942, that number was rapidly climbing toward 600 and would eventually go much higher. Ammunition production doubled. The production of the vital 88mm anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns surged. Speer achieved this not by building new factories. There was no time and no concrete for that, but by rationalizing the existing ones. He ruthlessly standardized production. Before 1942, Germany was producing dozens of different types of trucks and vehicles, a logistical nightmare for spare parts. Speer slashed the number of variants. He forced companies that had been competitors for decades to share patents and secrets. If one factory had a better way of casting a turret, they were now ordered to teach that method to their rivals. He created a system where the best practice became the only practice. This period also saw the prioritization of a new generation of German armor, the Tiger and the Panther. These were fearsome weapons designed to counter the Soviet T-34. Under the old system, their development might have dragged on for years. Under Speer, they were rushed into production. While they suffered from teething issues due to this haste, their arrival on the battlefield changed the tactical calculus of the war. The propaganda machine led by Joseph Goebbels turned Speer into a superstar. He was presented as a genius technocrat, the calm, rational man who was taming the chaos. He was the good Nazi, the professional who just wanted to make things work. This image of the Speer miracle persisted for decades after the war. Speer himself, in his memoirs, would claim that he simply applied common sense to a madhouse. However, modern economic historians like Adam Tooze argue that we must look at this miracle with a skeptical eye. Much of the production boom in 1942 was not just Speer's genius, but the result of massive capital investments made years earlier finally coming online. Speer was harvesting the crops that had been planted by his predecessors. Furthermore, the slack in the German economy was so massive that any competent manager could have improved the numbers simply by stopping the blatant waste. Germany had been underproducing so severely that the only way was up, but there was a darker, more fundamental cost to this efficiency that the spreadsheets didn't show. To double production, you need 3 things: raw materials, energy, and labor. Germany was blockaded. They were short on oil, rubber, and rare metals. Speer managed materials by ruthlessly cutting civilian production. The making of consumer goods, which had been protected in the early years to keep morale high, was finally slashed. The German civilian population began to feel the pinch of total war for the first time. The furniture factories were converted to make wooden airframe parts. The porcelain factories made electrical insulators. But the most critical shortage was labor. You can streamline a factory all you want, but you still need human hands to operate the lathes and the presses. And in 1942, the German workforce was vanishing. The Wehrmacht was bleeding to death in Russia. Every month, tens of thousands of able-bodied German men were pulled out of factories and sent to the Eastern Front to plug the holes in the line. So, here was a deadly equation Speer faced. How do you double production while your workforce is being drafted and sent to die in Stalingrad? The architect looked at the numbers. He realized that German women would not be mobilized. Hitler refused to allow it, believing a woman's place was in the home, producing future soldiers, not shells. So, Speer turned his gaze elsewhere. He realized that if the German men were going to fight, someone else had to work, and they would not be paid volunteers. In the spring of 1942, Speer struck a deal with a man named Fritz Sauckel, the newly appointed plenipotentiary for labor deployment. While Speer managed the machines, Sauckel would manage the flesh. This partnership will become the engine of the German war economy for the rest of the conflict. The armaments miracle was about to be fueled by a massive influx of human misery. The clean technocrat was about to become the largest slave driver in human history. As the production graphs in Speer's office climbed higher, representing thousands of new tanks and planes, trains were beginning to roll from the occupied territories in the east, heading toward the industrial heartlands of the Ruhr and Silesia. They were not carrying coal. They were carrying people. The decision to save the German army had been made, but the price would be paid by the populations of Europe. Instead, Hitler summoned Albert Speer. Speer was young, ambitious, and totally untrained in industrial management. He was a man who made models of Germania, the future capital of the world. He was the man who worried about marble and granite, not steel and coal. To the seasoned generals of the Wehrmacht, his appointment was a joke, a sign of Hitler's amateurism. They assumed Speer would be a puppet, easily manipulated or ignored. They were wrong. They had severely underestimated the architect. Speer was about to treat the German economy not as a business, but as a construction site. He was about to strip away the bureaucracy with a ruthlessness that even the military could not match. He was about to prove that a single, focused mind, unburdened by tradition and empowered by a dictator, could squeeze blood from a stone. As Albert Speer walked into his new ministry in February 1942, he found a system in collapse. Production figures were stagnant. The army in the east was screaming for shells. The air war over Germany was intensifying. The engineer had arrived, and his first decision would be to declare war on his own generals. The era of the miracle was about to begin, but the question remained, was it a miracle of genius or a miracle of destruction? By early 1943, the German war machine was, in many ways, no longer German. If you were to walk the floor of a tank factory in Kassel or an aircraft assembly hall in Regensburg during this period, the sounds of the factory had changed. The harsh, rhythmic shouts of German foremen were drowned out by a babble of languages. You would hear Polish, Russian, French, Dutch, and Czech. The faces at the lathes were no longer the well-fed, middle-aged German craftsmen of 1940. They were gaunt, terrified ghosts. They were men and women wearing mismatched rags, wooden clogs, or striped uniforms. The armaments miracle that Albert Speer proudly presented to Hitler in his leather-bound dossiers was not running on efficiency alone. It was running on slavery. The Nazi regime had made a cold, calculated decision. The only way to sustain a war of attrition against the world was to consume the population of occupied Europe. This was the dark underbelly of Speer's technocratic revolution, the variable in his equations that he conveniently ignored in his post-war apologies. If you believe it is vital to remember these historical realities and the human cost behind the statistics of war, please subscribe to our channel. We are committed to telling the whole story, however uncomfortable it may be. To understand the scale of this operation, we must look at the demographics. By 1943, roughly 1 in 4 workers in the German economy was a foreigner. In the armament sector specifically, that number was often much higher. In some key factories, forced laborers made up 40, 50, or even 60% of the workforce. The dynamic between Albert Speer and Fritz Sauckel was the engine of this misery. Speer was the client. Sauckel was the supplier. Speer would calculate that to meet the Führer's quota for 2,000 new fighter planes, he needed 50,000 additional workers. He would pass this requisition to Sauckel. Sauckel would then scour the occupied territories, using press gang tactics, kidnapping, and terror to fill cattle cars with human beings and ship them to the Reich. Speer later claimed he was just an administrator who requested labor in the abstract, but documents show he was intimately involved. He complained when the trains were late. He complained when the workers were too weak to work. He demanded drastic measures to ensure quotas were met. The architect was building his monument's production on a foundation of bones. The conditions these workers faced were dictated by a twisted racial hierarchy. Workers from Western Europe, the French, the Dutch, were treated harshly but were seen as civilized. They might receive meager wages and slightly better rations. At the bottom were the Ostarbeiter, the Eastern workers from the Soviet Union, and the concentration camp inmates. For these people, the factory was a slow-motion execution chamber. They worked 12-hour shifts on starvation rations. They slept in unheated barracks surrounded by barbed wire. This was the concept of Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through labor. But this reliance on slave labor introduced a fatal flaw into the German war effort, one that Speer's rationalization couldn't fix. Modern warfare requires high-precision engineering. A Panzer engine or AV-2 rocket guidance system requires exact tolerances. When you force a starving, terrified prisoner to operate a complex machine, the quality of production inevitably plummets. Sabotage became an invisible front line. A loose screw here, a handful of sand in a gearbox there, a weld that looked solid but would crack under stress. How many German tanks broke down at Kursk or in Normandy not because of enemy fire, but because the slave labor who built them quietly struck a blow for freedom? We will never know the exact number, but Wehrmacht complaints about declining quality skyrocketed in 1943. And just as Speer was ramping up this grim system, a new force arrived to tear it down. The Allies had opened a second front, not on the beaches of France, but in the sky. 1943 marked the beginning of the serious combined bomber offensive. The British RAF Bomber Command struck by night, engaging in area bombing designed to destroy entire cities. The American 8th Air Force struck by day, attempting precision bombing of specific factories. Speer suddenly found himself fighting a war on two fronts, one against the inefficiency of the German system, and another against the British and Americans trying to burn that system to the ground. The Battle of the Ruhr began in March 1943. The industrial heartland of Germany was pounded night after night. Krupp's factories in Essen were turned into twisted metal. The dams were breached. The cities were set aflame. Here, Speer showed a different kind of genius, a genius for improvisation. He created Ruhr staffs and mobile repair squads. When a factory was bombed, these squads would rush in, often while the fires were still burning. They would clear the rubble, reconnect the power lines, and get the machines running again, sometimes in the open air without a roof. Speer realized that while buildings are easy to destroy, heavy machine tools, cast iron lathes and presses, are incredibly hard to kill. You can bury them in brick, but you can dig them out and turn them on. In 1943, the war became a race. Could the Allies destroy German industry faster than Speer could rebuild it? Remarkably, for this year, Speer was winning. Despite the bombing, German production continued to rise. He was successfully dispersing factories, moving them into the countryside, into schools, barns, and smaller workshops to hide them from the bombers. But the stress on the system was accumulating. The miracle was becoming brittle. And as the year turned to 1944, the Allies were about to switch tactics. They would stop just hammering the cities and start hunting the lifeblood of the machine, the oil. And Speer, for all his organizational brilliance, could not build a factory that produced oil out of thin air. The ceiling was about to collapse. By the summer of 1944, the narrative of the war had become a tale of two realities. On the map, the Third Reich was shrinking. The Allies were ashore in Normandy. The Red Army was smashing through Army Group Center in Operation Bagration. But on the desk of Albert Speer in Berlin, the graphs told a different, almost unbelievable story. In 1944, under the heaviest bombardment in the history of warfare, with the enemies at the gates, German armaments production did not collapse. It peaked. This is one of the most counterintuitive statistics of the Second World War. How is it possible that a nation being turned into rubble could produce more tanks and aircraft than ever before? In 1944, Germany produced over 40,000 military aircraft, more than in any previous year. They produced over 19,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. If you looked only at the production spreadsheets, you would think Germany was winning. This paradox was a result of Speer's desperate strategy of dispersal. After the devastating raids on the Ruhr in 1943, Speer realized that giant, centralized factory complexes were death traps. So he shattered the German industrial base into thousands of tiny fragments. The production of ball bearings, tank transmissions, and aircraft engines was moved out of the cities. Factories were set up in school gymnasiums in remote Bavarian villages, in abandoned textile mills in Silesia, in barns hidden in the Black Forest, and even in beer halls. Speer's recovery commandos became experts at logistical resurrection. When a factory was hit, they would rush in, pull the heavy machinery out of the ruins, grease it up, load it onto trucks, and have it running in a new location within weeks. It was a logistical nightmare to coordinate. Parts had to be trucked back and forth across a crumbling rail network, but it made the industry almost impossible to knock out with a single blow. The Allies were trying to kill a swarm of ants with a sledgehammer. If you are interested in the strategic complexities of the air war and the controversial choices made by Allied commanders, please make sure to subscribe. We explore these tactical debates in depth in our upcoming series on the combined bomber offensive. However, this resilience came at a terrible price. While production numbers look good on Speer's charts, the armaments miracle of 1944 was, in many ways, a statistical illusion. They were producing thousands of fighter planes. Yes, the Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were rolling off the dispersed assembly lines in record numbers. But a plane is useless without three things: a pilot, ammunition, and fuel. And while Speer was successfully hiding the factories, he could not hide the oil refineries. In May 1944, the Allies made a decision that arguably ended the war. General Carl Spaatz of the U.S. Army Air Forces finally convinced Eisenhower to switch targets. They stopped focusing solely on dehousing German workers and started hunting the lifeblood of the war machine, the synthetic oil plants. This was the checkmate move. The huge refineries at Luna, Politz, and Gelsenkirchen were massive, stationary targets. They could not be moved into a barn. The 8th Air Force pounded them into oblivion. On May 12, 1944, the first massive raid struck. Speer famously rushed to the Luna plant to inspect the damage. What he saw terrified him. The tangled piping and shattered distillation columns meant that the production of aviation fuel had ceased. Speer wrote a memo to Hitler that was uncharacteristically blunt. He stated that this new bombing campaign meant the end of the war was effectively decided. Without fuel, the thousands of new tanks produced by the miracle were nothing more than steel bunkers. They could not maneuver. They could not attack. They could only sit and wait to be destroyed. The Luftwaffe, flush with new planes, was grounded. New pilots could not be trained because there was no gas for training flights. The miracle was producing weapons for an army that could not move. Furthermore, the decision to focus purely on production numbers led to a cannibalization of the future. To keep the assembly lines moving, Speer's ministry began to cut corners on spare parts. It looks better on a report to say you built 1,000 new tanks than to say you built 500 tanks and enough spare transmissions to keep the old ones running. The result was a Wehrmacht that was rich in new equipment, but critically poor in sustainability. If a Tiger tank broke down in Normandy, it was often abandoned and blown up by its own crew because there were no spares to fix it. The miracle was producing disposable weapons for a disposable army. The chaos of the bombing also broke the spine of the German transport network. The Reichsbahn, the railway system, was being strangled. You might have a dispersed factory in Bavaria that has successfully built 50 engines, but if the railway bridge leading out of the town is at the bottom of the river, those engines go nowhere. By late 1944, Germany was suffering from a fatal disconnect. The armaments were in the south, the coal was in the west, and the armies were dying in the east. The arteries of the Reich were clogged with wreckage. In the midst of this fiery collapse, the Nazi leadership retreated further into delusion. Hitler demanded wonder weapons, the V-1, the V-2, the jet fighters. He believed that technology could reverse the tide of strategic defeat. Speer, ever the obedient technocrat, shifted resources to these projects. The V-2 rocket program alone cost more than the Manhattan Project's development of the atomic bomb in terms of relative economic effort. And what did it achieve? It killed civilians in London and Antwerp, but it did not stop a single Allied soldier from crossing the Rhine. It was a colossal waste of scarce resources, aluminum, electronics, and alcohol fuel, that could have been used to build thousands of conventional fighters to defend the German skies. By the winter of 1944, the factories were still churning, but the nation was dying. The cities were moonscapes of craters and hollowed-out facades. The civilians lived in cellars, emerging like troglodytes to clear the rubble. And yet, the gears kept turning. Why? Because the terror of the regime had become absolute. To stop working was to be arrested for defeatism. To suggest the war was lost was a capital offense. And for Albert Speer, the destruction of the surface world left only one option. If the sky belonged to the Allies, the German war machine would have to leave the surface of the earth entirely. They would have to go where the bombs couldn't reach, into the mountains, into the caves. The final phase of the German war economy would not take place in the light of day, but in the damp, suffocating darkness of the underground. And it is there in the tunnels of the Harz Mountains that the moral abyss of the Third Reich would reach its absolute bottom. Winter 1944. The surface of Germany is a moonscape. The great industrial cities of the Ruhr are smoldering ruins. The rail yards are twisted knots of steel. Allied fighter bombers roam the skies over the autobahns, shooting at anything that moves. For the Third Reich, the world above ground has become uninhabitable. But deep in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, inside a hollowed-out hill known as the Konstein, the war is still very much alive. Here, buried under millions of tons of gypsum and rock, lies the final, dystopian evolution of Albert Speer's economic miracle. It is called Mittelwerk, the Central Works. It is a subterranean factory complex consisting of 2 parallel tunnels, each over a mile long, connected by dozens of cross galleries. It is a city of the dead, lit by harsh electric floodlights, filled with the deafening roar of jackhammers and the smell of ammonia, dust, and rotting flesh. In this concrete tomb, the most advanced technology in human history is being assembled by men living in conditions that predate the Stone Age. If you are interested in the dark intersection of technological progress and human cruelty, the paradox that defined the 20th century, please verify that you are subscribed. We are dedicated to exploring these uncomfortable truths with the depth they deserve. The product being built here is the V2 rocket, the vengeance weapon. It is the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a technological marvel capable of leaving the atmosphere and striking London at supersonic speeds. It is the ancestor of the rockets that will one day take humanity to the moon. But the story of the V2 is not one of scientific triumph. It is a story of economic insanity and moral bankruptcy. Albert Speer championed the move underground. He realized that no amount of flak guns could protect the factories on the surface. So he ordered the SS to blast these tunnels out of the rock at a breakneck pace. The construction of Mittelwerk was a crime against humanity of staggering proportions. Thousands of prisoners from the Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp were forced to sleep inside the tunnels while they dug them. They lived in the cold, damp darkness for months, choking on the rock dust, deprived of sunlight, hygiene, or adequate food. The mortality rate was catastrophic. When a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, he was simply dragged aside and a new unit was brought in to replace him. Speer visited these tunnels. In his post-war memoirs, he would claim to have been shocked by the conditions, describing them as dantesque. He claimed he ordered improvements, but the historical record tells a different story. Speer demanded speed. He demanded output. When production of the V2 lagged, he didn't ask for better rations for the workers. He asked for more workers. The technocrat saw the human beings in those tunnels not as victims, but as a resource, a biological fuel to be burned in the furnace of production. The tragic irony of Mittelwerk is that the weapon it produced was militarily useless. The V2 rocket was a feat of engineering, but as a strategic weapon, it was a failure. It carried a 1-ton warhead, roughly the same payload as a single conventional bomber could drop. But a bomber could be reused. A V2 was a single-use weapon that cost a fortune to build. The guidance system was primitive. The rockets often missed their targets by miles. They killed civilians in London and Antwerp, causing terror, but they did not destroy a single port, factory, or troop concentration. They did not slow the Allied advance by a single hour. Economically, the V2 program was a disaster. It consumed vast amounts of aluminum, high-grade steel, and electrical components, resources that were critically needed for production of defensive fighter jets. Even more absurd was the fuel. The V2 ran on ethanol, alcohol distilled from potatoes. In the final year of the war, while the German population was facing starvation, thousands of tons of potatoes were being fermented to fuel rockets that were exploding uselessly in British cow pastures. It was the ultimate triumph of ideology over reality. By early 1945, The Mittelwerk facility was churning out rockets, but the system around it was disintegrating. The paradox of Speer's armaments miracle had reached its logical conclusion. You can build a rocket in a cave, but you cannot fly from a cave. To be launched, the V-2S had to be loaded onto trains and moved to launch sites in the Netherlands and Western Germany. But the German rail network had finally collapsed. The Allied transportation plan, the systematic bombing of bridges and marshalling yards, had severed the arteries of the Reich. In the final months of the war, stockpiles of advanced weaponry sat stranded at factory gates. Brand new Tiger II tanks sat on flatbed cars that had no locomotives to pull them. Jet fighters sat on runways with empty fuel tanks. And V-2 rockets piled up in the tunnels of the Harz Mountains. Speer, traveling through a collapsing Germany in his high-powered car, saw the end coming. He saw the roads clogged with refugees. He saw the soldiers retreating without ammunition, and yet the orders from his ministry continued to demand production. The bureaucracy had taken on a zombie-like life of its own. Reports were filed, quotas were adjusted, and telegrams were sent, even as the Red Army was crossing the Oder River and the Americans were crossing the Rhine. In these final weeks, the architect began to pivot. He realized that Hitler was determined to drag the entire nation down with him. Hitler issued the Nero Decree, the order to destroy all German infrastructure, bridges, dams, factories, power plants. If the war was lost, Hitler reasoned, the German people had failed and deserved to perish. Speer, who had spent 3 years tirelessly building the war machine, now decided to disobey his master. He began a frantic tour of the front lines, not to spur production, but to sabotage the destruction orders. He met with generals and Gauleiters, persuading them to spare the bridges and the factories, arguing that the German people would need them to survive after the war. It was a late, desperate attempt to salvage some shred of morality, or perhaps some shred of a defense of the inevitable trial. The man who had extended the war by years, who had greased the wheels of the machine with the blood of millions, was now trying to save the wreckage. But as the Allied armies closed in on the Mittelwerk, and the SS guards began to massacre the remaining prisoners in the tunnels to hide the evidence, it was clear that for thousands of people, Speer's change of heart had come far, far too late. The miracle was over. The nightmare was ending, and Albert Speer was about to face the judgment of the world. May 23, 1945. Flensburg, northern Germany. The Third Reich has ceased to exist. Adolf Hitler is dead. The cities are smoking ruins. British soldiers burst into the Glucksburg Castle, headquarters of the makeshift German government. They arrest the remaining Nazi leadership. Most of them are defiant, terrified, or suicidal. But one man stands apart. He is calm, well-dressed, and polite. He has packed his bags. He treats the British officers not as conquerors, but as colleagues. Albert Speer surrendered with the air of a man who believed he had nothing to hide, or perhaps the air of a man who had already constructed his final and greatest design, his own defense. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, were the stage for Speer's masterpiece of manipulation. While Hermann Göring postured as a fallen warlord and others claimed they were just following orders, Speer took a different, more sophisticated path. He became the good Nazi. He looked the judges in the eye and admitted overall responsibility for crimes of the regime. Yet, and this was the crucial sleight of hand, he denied specific knowledge of the Holocaust. He painted a picture of himself as a pure technocrat, a man so blinded by the challenge of production quotas and logistics that he simply didn't see the monster he was feeding. If you have watched this series to the end, thank you. Understanding the mechanics of the past is the only way to safeguard the future. If you want to see more analyses of historical leadership under extreme pressure, please subscribe and leave a comment on who we should profile next. Speer's defense was seductive to the Western Allies. In the dawn of the Cold War, they saw in him something familiar, a rational manager, a man of science and industry, so unlike the fanatical SS thugs. He charmed the prosecution. He provided technical data on the German economy that the Allies were desperate to study. And it worked. While his partner, Fritz Sauckel, the man who procured the slave labor, was sentenced to hang, Albert Speer, the man who requested that labor, was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison. He escaped the noose. For decades after his release in 1966, Speer became a literary sensation. His memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, cemented the Speer Myth. He presented himself as a gentleman architect who had made a pact with the devil Hitler, but had maintained his soul. He claimed his armaments miracle was a triumph of German organizational genius. Historians and military analysts in the 1960s and 70s largely accepted this narrative. They marveled at the production statistics of 1944. They studied his management techniques. But history is a slow-moving judge, and eventually, the evidence caught up with the architect. Modern research, led by historians like Adam Tooze and Dan van der Vat, has shattered the Speer myth. We now know that Speer was not a blind technocrat. He was deeply, intimately involved in the expansion of the concentration camp system. He visited Mauthausen. He allocated funds for construction of Barak camps at Auschwitz. He knew exactly where his human fuel was coming from, and he knew exactly what happened to them when they were spent. But the most chilling verdict on Albert Speer is not legal. It is statistical. It brings us back to the central question of this documentary. What was the actual result of his genius? By rationalizing the German economy in 1942, by tripling production of tanks and planes, and by keeping the war machine running on fumes and slave labor, Albert Speer did not change the outcome of the war. Germany was always going to lose against the combined industrial might of the Allies. What Speer did was change the duration of the war. Without Speer's intervention, the German economy likely would have collapsed under its own inefficiency by 1943. The war might have ended 2 years earlier. By extending the conflict into 1944 and 1945, Speer bought time. But time for what? Those 2 extra years were the bloodiest in human history. The vast majority of the Holocaust, the industrial liquidation of European Jewry, occurred in the years Speer kept the trains running. The vast majority of German military casualties occurred after 1942. The destruction of German cities by bombing happened almost entirely during Speer's tenure. The Red Army's vengeful drive into Central Europe was only possible because the Wehrmacht had the weapons to keep fighting a losing battle. Albert Speer's competence was a curse. His ability to squeeze one more tank, one more shell, and one more month of resistance out of a dying system didn't save Germany. It destroyed it completely. It turned a defeat into an annihilation. In the end, Albert Speer stands as a terrifying warning to the modern world. He proves that intelligence, education, and organizational brilliance are not moral virtues. A system can be efficient, productive, and technologically advanced, and yet be utterly, irredeemably evil. The architect built a machine that worked perfectly, right up until the moment it consumed everything, including himself.